The Grim Drive podcast explores mental health through the lens of professional sports and athletes. Pro athletes come forward more and more with stories about their mental health journey, what they have endured, and how they managed to push through, reflecting a mental health stigma that continues to be reduced. Pro athletes also leverage mindset to achieve peak performance, as well as representing and often driving elements of popular culture through the use of social media, technology, and personal branding. This places athletes front and center as role models for people of all ages, giving them a platform to reach many and deliver important information, including information about mental health. Welcome to the Grim Drive podcast, where we explore mental health through the lens of professional sports and athletes. My name is Jotham Busfield. I'm here with my co-host, John Cuna. Today we'll be discussing Michael Phelps and ADHD. Quick bio, Michael Phelps is an American former competitive swimmer and the most successful and most decorated Olympian of all time, with a total of 28 medals, including 23 gold medals, from competing in 5 different Olympic Games, 2000, 2004, 2008, 2012, and 2016. He's widely regarded as the greatest swimmer of all time and is often considered to be one of the greatest athletes of all time. A few random facts about Michael Phelps. By the age of 10, he had a national record for his age group in the 100-meter butterfly, and as of 2018, he still held 11 age group records. Qualified for his first Olympics at age 15, and that was in the 2000 Olympics. He finished 5th in the 200-meter butterfly. A common myth is that he ate 12,000 calories a day per day while training. He calls that exaggerated, said it didn't happen.
Yeah.
Let's see. He lives in Arizona with his wife and 3 kids and helps coach the Arizona State swim team. Cites Michael Jordan as his sports idol and roots for the Baltimore Ravens, which we will try not to hold against him. Can't promise anything. After the 2008 Summer Olympics, Phelps started the Michael Phelps Foundation, which focuses on growing the sport of swimming and promoting healthier lifestyles. In 2017, he joined the board of MetaBio, a company focused on the diagnosis of mental health disorders. We could put a link to the Michael Phelps Foundation in the show notes. So for the player spotlight today, obviously the athlete spotlight, we're going to focus on Michael Phelps. He's done a lot of interviews. He started talking about his mental health, I think, around 2016. He's done the Weight of Gold documentary on HBO Max, which was fantastic. We're going to get into that. He did a video interview along with DeMar DeRozan. They were interviewed by Taylor Rooks, who's a sports journalist. And numerous other articles have been written about him in terms of his career as a swimmer and his thoughts on his own mental health experience. So, in terms of Michael Phelps and our takeaways, I'm gonna lead, John, then I'm gonna kick it to you a little bit. The reason we made this episode about ADHD is because ADHD is often the initial diagnosis that drives other secondary mental health issues. And I think Michael Phelps is someone who's diagnosed with ADHD in 6th grade. When he comes out about mental health in 2016, he's not really talking about ADHD. And I think that's why it's so important that we get into this, because ADHD often serves as the first diagnosis that leads to a lot of people who have ADHD as being diagnosed with other things later on, often because of what ADHD does to their self-image and confidence and mental health and things like that. So he was diagnosed with ADHD in 6th grade. Swimming was an outlet for his energy. Also worth noting, his parents got divorced when he was 9 years old, which he said had a severe negative impact on him and his 2 older siblings. I would imagine that was a crucial thing. To go through that at any age is hard, but at 9 is really, really tough. His mom, who is a middle school principal, I believe, advocated for him a lot within the school system, which is really important. I'm sure she kind of knew how to do that a little bit more with being a principal. She used the hand gesture for the letter C for composed as a gesture and cue to him, which I think is pretty cool. So he would see her doing that from the stands, and it would be a cue for him. We talk a lot about ADHD and how cues are really, really important, and we'll get into that. She told his tutor to use word problems tailored to his interests. So, in terms of a math problem, how many meters would a swimmer have to swim to be able to do X, Y, Z? I think that's really key for ADHD, is being able to, not just for parents and teachers to do this, but for we work a lot with kids, but kids, adults who have ADHD, trying to find a way to turn subjects they find boring into something that overlaps with something they find interesting is really important. It's the only way to prevent, the lack of focus from kicking in hardcore when you're easily distracted. If you don't find it interesting with ADHD, that's like, forget about it, right? So you have to find creative ways to make things interesting and overlap them with things that you find, whether you're passionate about, that you find interesting. So that is really cool that his mom knew to do that. He stopped taking stimulant medications in 6th grade. His mother allowed that. The structure he had in swimming really helped. He was able to manage symptoms without the medication. A great example of how structure is like one of the main key factors when it comes to treating ADHD. You need to have structure in your life in order to overcome the distraction and the hyperactivity at times. ADHD helped him as a swimmer. We'll talk about this, but ADHD tends to be a bit of a superpower, right? That if people can learn how to harness it, it allows them to do things that people with ADHD without ADHD cannot do. And then, a teacher told him he would never amount to anything. I hear examples like this all the time. I wonder who these teachers are that are like saying this to kids. I really hear this quite a bit with athletes who are like, this teacher told me I was never going to amount to jack. And it's just like, who are the teachers that are given the responsibility of bringing youth up and teaching them the things they need to teach, and they're teaching them that they're never going to amount to anything. So I found that interesting. Clearly, he used it as fuel. So what were your key takeaways as we get into this, John?
Well, one thing you mentioned too, just a quick follow-up about, seeking relevance. I think that's definitely one of the things that we look to do a lot, right? So like Mom's point of make word problems about swimming, he's going to be engaged. I think that's the same process that we look to do a lot of times with ADHD kids of like, how do we make what you don't want to do relevant to what you do want to? And I definitely find that that's a lot of things that we do. My biggest takeaway that I took away was sort of the benefits of like the hyperfocus that we're hearing a lot more about, like that symptom of ADHD. It clearly was one of his major motivators to swimming, right? He talks a lot about that being like the place where he could be his most self. And that hyper focus really allowed, the countless extra hours he put in the pool, the extra work that he put in. If you listen to him talk about it, it wasn't work, it was joy. I mean, that's what he loved to do. And that was one of the things that really stood out to me is, that hyper focus, there is a place for it. And you talked about like harnessing the ADHD superpower and harnessing the hyper focus, I feel like is a component of doing that, because with focus and with attention on that, you can really direct it where you need it. But the downside to that is if it's gone awry and you don't have control, it can lead to burnout. And even honestly, I see this sometimes, a lot of times with athletes too, even like eventual resentment of their sport. And because I think part of this happens is because they're cultivating that hyperfocus, or that they're that sport as their one sense of confidence generation. And if they aren't doing the work to supplement that and add to it when they're injured or the sport goes away or they don't do very well, they crumble and they fall. And so the concept of hyperfocus for him was like that lighter fluid to like get him in the pool and keep him structured, and it didn't feel like work for him. It was just a part of what he needed to learn to do. And that's a lot of the stuff that I find myself doing with not just athletes but just kids in general with ADHD or adults with ADHD, of finding a way to manage the ADHD. I think a lot of times, I think we've talked about this in previous episodes before too, of like even the concept of an ADHD being a mental illness, I have a hard time feeling, right? Because I don't see it as an illness. I see it as something, once you learn how to manage and cultivate and guide it, it is this enormous resource of power. And I think that he was able to unlock that a little bit, at least in the beginning. We'll talk a little bit more about, the long-term effects of not managing it, the best, or if it's the only place you're going. But that was definitely the biggest thing that I took away, the first thing I took away definitely from doing a lot of this research on him.
Yeah, when we get into this section on really delving into the topic of ADHD, after we talk about Michael Phelps a little bit more, I definitely gonna want to get to that, because I hate the term disorder, and in general, I think it just does not cover accurately what someone with ADHD is capable of doing. Now, it might cover how in certain aspects or areas of life they are, not as good a match, for their strengths matching up to the context, right? Formal school environments, especially in the United States, is definitely one of them. Yeah. But deficit and disorder to me are just terms that I just don't think are necessary. I know why they're there. I think they're there because, we live in the whole DSM, diagnosis is so key for insurance purposes kind of world. But I think it really works against people diagnosed with this, because language matters. You get those, we in CBT, right, cognitive behavioral therapy, one of the types of unhealthy thought patterns that people have is self-labeling. you got two labels built into a diagnosis here, right? Deficit and disorder. And so it's like you're setting them off from the beginning at a huge disadvantage, because how do you not, especially because when people get diagnosed with ADHD, they tend to be, fifth, sixth, seventh grade, sometimes a little bit younger.
Yep.
How are you going to hear that you have a deficit and a disorder at that age and not really take that to heart and think there's something wrong with you?
Yep.
Right?
And I think a lot of the way that people in schools, a lot of times, the language around how they describe kids, typical kids that fit that profile for ADHD, they're constantly moving, distracting others, can't sit still. It's never about they're really resilient, they're extremely creative, they're entrepreneurial, they're energetic.
Yeah.
You don't really. I think that's getting better. I think as more education goes to the schools about these things, I think that there's definitely a shift being done. I think there's obviously extraordinary teachers, but I do think that the vast majority, that's the language that they've been fed. And how is it possible not to take that, internalize that as a person hearing that, like, I'm distracting other people, I have a deficit and disorder, especially because, like you said, those diagnoses are usually happening in like that prime age of development. It's hard not to take those things in.
Totally. And I think, it speaks to how, I don't want to blame schools entirely here, but there's a massive school issue when it comes to ADHD. And I don't quite blame the teachers. I think they're put in this position where they're supposed to, teach within the environment, within the context they've been taught to and they've been given the resources to, which is usually a, class size of 20 to 30. Kids have to sit still in their seats for long periods of time, and you are giving a lecture-based kind of, rote memorization style learning environment. Like, that's how you're delivering information to these kids. If you got a kid running around, like with unlimited energy, that's not going to fit all that well with what you're tasked to do as a teacher. So I get it, but this is why the school environment matters and the learning format matters. You get a kid with ADHD into a different type of learning environment where the school is tailored to this kind of thing, slightly smaller class sizes. Kids are allowed to be up on their feet, moving, using their hands, and a real world application of learning. They thrive. They absolutely thrive. And I think this, again, not teachers' faults, but, we could probably, I don't want to get off on a tangent here, but like, if you look at how recess has been reduced and reduced and reduced and removed, I mean, it's impossible for someone with, above average energy, let alone ADHD, to succeed in that environment where they have to sit still for 7 hours straight with no breaks, no recess, no ability to run around and get some of that energy out. So a little bit of a tangent there, but I think that the school system is a huge part of the problem with this kind of stuff. You touched on one other thing I want to reflect on, and that's where, how you touched on how hyperfocus is both a, superpower for people with ADHD, and it was for Michael Phelps in terms of the ability to. People without ADHD often struggle with this. They can't get so hyperfocused into one thing that they are absolutely committed to it. People with ADHD can do that to a ridiculous level. It allows them to succeed, and yet he even says something where you don't see what the consequences of that when you're young, right? What's going to happen later on. And to me, this is one of those situations where it's like what got you here won't get you there kind of thing, right? It's hard to know that until it's almost too late. But this is where we think, like, even a podcast like this might help educate people. If you have ADHD and you have a thing that allows you to hyperfocus and you're still relatively young, be careful, because you still want that. You still need it, but you got to plan. You got to find other things. You got to start planting seeds in other areas of your life, because if that thing is taken away, you're going to get the legs taken out from underneath you. It's going to leave you very vulnerable and possibly unnecessarily if you're able to start planting some of those seeds. We like to use that metaphor to find other things you're interested in, right? One example of this was our last episode, Serena Williams. I mean, she didn't have ADHD as far as I know, but she clearly does a great job at planting seeds, right? She's not just a tennis player. She's doing a lot of other things and has always planted seeds in areas where she's interested. And that protects you. That gives you things that you're passionate about in your life. So that if one goes away, you are not completely lost, right? Without direction, without a rudder, floating along with no idea how to solve the problem. So that was definitely one thing that I took away, based on what you said. I just wanted to reflect on that a little bit. Another takeaway I had was that he really didn't discuss these issues until 2016. I think he was 29, maybe a little bit older than that at that point. So he even says, like, I learned to communicate at 30, which we hear a lot. And I think, one, it's good that athletes are coming out and saying, hey, I didn't learn this until now. I also think, like, if you look at, developmentally, the brain's not even finished developing until you're 25. So I think even at best, usually you're learning to do this kind of stuff in your mid-20s. If you learn before that, If you learn before that, then it's gravy, right? So I think what led to him coming out about his mental health struggles in 2016 was right before the Rio Olympics, I think. It was 2014 that was really the breaking point. I think he got his second DUI, for driving under the influence of alcohol. He went to rehab. He talks about sitting in his room, I think after the arrest maybe, where he was not drinking water, not drinking anything, not eating.
Yeah, for like 5 days.
Clearly was dealing with depression and some suicidal thoughts, was in a very, very low place, and luckily, checked himself into rehab and was able to get help. But I think to me that it points to how substance abuse is often a likely way to numb already existing depression. This is very common with males when we talk about covert depression, right? Mm-hmm. Most people think of depression in general as your common signs of hopelessness and sadness and crying and low motivation, not being able to get out of bed. For a lot of guys, it's that. So that description is more of an overt depression, right? Overt meaning it's kind of obvious. That's what most people think. Covert or more hidden types of depression this is what guys tend to get. You see it through two main things, in my opinion: anger and substance abuse. Mm-hmm. A lot of guys do not cope with their depression or show their depression by crying and being sad. It's a huge problem. We've talked about this, right? The men's playbook that we've talked about so many times. Just suck it up, be stoic. Guys don't show depression through the typical signs. They often show it through anger and numbing themselves with substances, right? They just keep drinking, they smoke weed, they do different things that are just going to numb them. So it's key to know that, because if you know someone who's showing a guy who's showing a lot of anger and they're abusing substances, there's a good chance they might be dealing with depression on some level. So to tie this back into Michael Phelps, we've talked a lot about how, ADHD is the start of things.
Right.
It's very common for people with ADHD to eventually develop secondary issues like anxiety, depression, and substance abuse issues because they don't know how to cope with things. So that's where the substance abuse comes in, and the anxiety and depression tends to come into play because being diagnosed with ADHD and not having the support or services you need or that kind of thing at an early enough age, it just totally disrupts your sense of self. It makes you feel like you're hopeless, worthless, stupid, that kind of stuff, and it leads to a lot of issues. So.
Yeah, I kind of refer to it as like the ADHD to depression pipeline, right?
Yeah,
like if
totally.
It's sort of we do see that as a pretty natural progression. Not necessarily it's a guarantee, right? No one stoke fear for people listening, but we do see that progression a lot. ADHD not getting supports, their internal sense of self gets completely destroyed. That self-critic basically is allowed to just run amok inside, telling you you're no good, you're not enough, you're this. What's the point? You're being taught that you're being fed all these different things about yourself. You're telling yourself, but you're also getting those cues from either from schools or whatever it happens to be. And the gradual progression to this point is something that we see far too often.
Totally. I would say the most common progression I see is, or I guess you'd call it a regression, is ADHD. Starts with ADHD, eventually living with ADHD for a couple years maybe, right? Tends to lead to increased arguments with parents. Areas of life not going well in terms of functioning, grades going down, teachers getting mad at them, that kind of thing. And that breeds anxiety, right? Anxiety starts to bubble up. They start to worry about themselves. They start to worry about outcomes in their life. And we talked about the depression and anxiety being the flip side of the same coin.
Yeah.
You deal with anxiety for long enough, you are way more vulnerable to have depression set in because, you have to fuel the anxiety with something and all your energy is going to that. Eventually it's going to lead to a letdown, right? Depression and mood. And that's what depression is. It's a depressed mood. So we definitely see that progression a lot. Hearing him talk, he sounds a lot like Kevin Love, right? When Kevin Love was talking about what it was like to be away from basketball during his wrist injury when he couldn't play, it's clear that the overlap between the act, in this case the sport, and the identity or self-worth was way too much of an overlap there. So that when that thing is taken away, they are lost, right? We covered that a little bit in the beginning in terms of that hyperfocus is something that's going to allow you to be successful, but also sets you up to be very vulnerable if and when that sport, is taken away, because that's your whole identity being taken away. Swimming was his main outlet and his source of self-worth. So again, not only is it tied to your identity and self-worth, but it's your main outlet to cope with life.
Right.
So now it's like you're just losing
stuck.
everything.
Yeah.
He admits to compartmentalizing everything, right? Again, mental health issues tend to be cumulative, right? There's a buildup there. And if you're just compartmentalizing and holding it all in, there's no outlet to get it all out. And he even talks about feeling like even today, feeling like he's not good enough, which to me is just yet more proof that mental health issues do not discriminate against
Right.
Socioeconomic status or Olympian champion stat. Right,
Right.
That
Best
doesn't
swimmer
care.
of all time.
Yeah, best swimmer of all time, most gold medals of all time. And still feels like he's not good enough. It hits a lot of different people, right?
Yeah.
Regardless of what you've accomplished, which is again another reason to not tie your self-worth to accomplishments or outcomes, because that is not going to work, or it might delude you into thinking it's going to work temporarily, but it doesn't long term. Any other takeaways for you, John?
No, I think, and we talk about the concept of identity and stuff like that, and especially in with athletes and pieces like that. And then, for me personally too, as someone with ADHD, and I was an athlete, and I can relate to a lot of the conversations that I hear other athletes talking about, because growing up, I did have that. Track and field was my outlet, right?
Yeah.
That was my thing. I was, I fit all the markers for the stuff that we're talking about that you want to be looking out for, right?
Yeah.
Like my outcomes was where I found all of my joy. Like I rated myself on my race, on that number, what that time was, where I was ranked amongst everybody else in the league, and all those different things. That's where I was, and to a certain extent, it helped me, find peace. And other athletes will talk about it, but there's something to be said about being in a place that feels your most self. It's addicting. And it gives you the release, and it gives you a sense of purpose. But what we've talked about before is that for me, it was my only sense of purpose. And when I raced through college, and I battled injuries throughout, and then just had one injury that sort of ended it for me. And because I didn't have a strong mental health, I really crumbled and went into a state of depression based after that for a long period of time. I put all my eggs in one basket, and they all, and that was it. And I think that you hear Phelps talk about that a lot. You heard Marcus DeRozan talk about that. You heard Kevin Love talk about that. You hear all the athletes who talk about that of like, if you've got this one pillar that you're cultivating for all of your self-worth and purpose and all those things, when it goes away, then what? And, I think that's definitely something that I related to when I was listening to Phelps talk, because I was like, that's a little bit like me. And I think, when I was growing up with ADHD, constantly felt like I was far behind with everybody else. I definitely had a chip on my I don't have an experience where the teacher told me I wasn't going to amount to anything, but I certainly felt that way, regardless of having that conversation.
It may have been communicated through how they treated you more than like the words necessarily, but that still matters.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And I had a mom who was, I joke sometimes. I had a friend come up and asked if my mom actually worked at the school, because she was up there so often giving me support and trying to help me, get things like that. I think, that I was lucky to be able to have that, but it's still, even with that, it really didn't affect the way that I thought about myself. And, and I kind of went through that progression of like having ADHD. I was getting treatment to a certain extent, but it wasn't enough. I wasn't talking to somebody the way that I have conversations with people now. It was sort of just like, take the stimulant, do this extended time on tests, and it was sort of like this system that was supposed to work, and it obviously didn't, because one of the things that was missing for me was I wasn't able to track still only remained my one source of outlet. I didn't have another avenue for that. And I hear a lot of athletes talking specifically about that, of like their sport is their outlet. So when injury happens, if it happens, or when they walk away from the sport, they're left with this deep sense of like a hole, like, well, I've spent my entire life, this is what I've known, and now it no longer works. What do I do? I think that's a big wake-up call, and Phelps talks a lot about that.
Totally. No, and one thing you touched on is that, like, sometimes as a kid, if your parents are advocating for you a lot, it almost makes you feel worse.
Right.
Because you're sitting there wondering,
why can't I do this?
Yeah, why can't I do this?
Right.
Like, I don't want this special treatment, or my friends don't need this. What? And it's hard because you're so young and you're so self-judgmental. That parents doing the right thing can actually unintentionally make you feel worse, because you're so self-judgmental in those moments.
Yeah, it was embarrassment, right? It wasn't like, oh, the supportive mother. It was like, I'm embarrassed by the fact that my mom has to be here. What is wrong with me that my mom has to be joked about that she works at the school,
Exactly.
So, and that all played in, and we talked about this in previous episodes, but that was the narrative that I was practicing for years, years and years and years, and it took me a long time to unlearn that narrative and restructure a new one.
Absolutely. And you mentioned one thing when talking about your track career and the Olympic track and things like that, the track on the path to trying to get to the Olympics being kind of addictive. And, one note I had made about, when I was watching the Way to Gold documentary was that there's almost a seductive nature to the Olympics, right? Where it's like, you can tell that it's tough for athletes to resist the urge to want to achieve that, right? It's like this like all encompassing, so important on a pedestal, literally on a pedestal
Yeah,
kind of
pun
thing.
intended.
Yeah, and that is very seductive. And I think sometimes because of that, but also because I think the federation probably doesn't care about making the complete picture available to them. I don't think they get the full picture ahead of time of what that life is going to be like, especially after.
Right.
And that was clear. Like, it talked about the, post-Olympic kind of blues or post-Olympic depression, and it was clear that a lot of Olympians deal with that. You know, one question that stood out to me about that documentary is, and I wanted to ask you this: do you think it's even possible for an Olympic athlete to have balance? Right? We talked about how Grim Drive is really it's not about workaholism and not having balance. It's about finding that line, finding your purpose, and just relentlessly committing to that, but also having your other key aspects of your life balanced, whether it comes to socially or personally. You're getting that balance. Is it actually? I came away feeling like I don't even know if it's possible for an Olympic athlete to have that balance. Do you think it is?
I don't know. I think it's a good question. I guess I hope that it is, right? Because the way that it's structured now clearly isn't working for athletes, a large majority. I think Michael Phelps, I'm not sure where he got the percentage from, but I think he mentioned something up of like 80% of Olympic athletes post Olympics feel like this state of depression or this post Olympic blues.
Very high.
That's an enormous
it's
number.
Insane, yeah.
So I'd like to believe that it's possible. I think that it is. I think with more conversations like this, I think with more education, I think with more Michael Phelps was talking about his growing up and going through the committee that sort of oversaw swimming for the Olympics, never had conversations about his mental health, never had conversations about supporting those different things. And I think that there's definitely places where work could be done to try to have a little bit of balance. But to your point, right, it's like eat, sleep, and perform. Like that's the life of those athletes. It's like you wake up, what do I got to do to get to get a gold medal, right? And it's just that singular focus, and it's hard to, does that, again, it comes back to that balance of like that hyper focus of like using it as a fuel, but if you burn it too long, you're going to be you're going to burn out.
Totally.
And I think there is room for balance. I think there's a lot of things that need to be done, and before then, like I said, like joining with organizations, I think helping even like at a younger level, coaching coaches on how to coach, right? Like, we talked about anger in our previous episode, and I think to a certain extent, especially with guys, anger is a coached practice. And I think that we could be coaching more vulnerability, right? The importance of being able to be open and talk about what might be going on, the importance for coaches to have conversations with athletes about both personal and professional goals, helping them to address those things. You're seeing more of that now, but I think there are ways to do that. But as of right now, I don't see enough where there can be a balance, unfortunately.
Yeah, and they talk about how there's no real mental health support other than sports psychology. And again, it's like some of the athletes clearly were resentful of this in that documentary, where it's like, yeah, great, you're helping with my mindset, but only as it relates to like me being great at this sport for your federation and that kind of thing. Instead
right, it
of
was
like,
for not their purpose, not their purpose.
You're being treated like a product instead of like a person. So some non-sports related mental health is clearly needed. There's no post-sport compensation or support. I don't know enough about the economics or the business side of the Olympics to know whether that's possible or not. I mean, I think whether it is or isn't from that side, I'm sure there's some way to wrap in, services through charitable means or something like that, so these people can get support, because they clearly need it and they deserve it if they're going to dedicate 4 years of their life or more to representing the country and that kind of thing. So
for most of these guys, their entire lives they're dedicating to it up
absolutely
until that point.
Absolutely. And so I think some mental health support is really needed. I think planning, post-Olympic planning, and again, we talk about planting seeds. You don't have to wait. I think this is what happens. They work to this one moment, and where it can be made or broken, right? I'm going to get to that in a second. And then after that, it's just, falling off a cliff, right? There's nothing after. There's nothing planned. There's nothing. There's no structure for them afterwards. I think that's a huge piece that needs to be in place. Prepping and visualizing. We talk about a lot about positive visualization. It doesn't have to just be about sports. It can be about, right, after this, what do you see yourself doing? How can you cultivate that a little bit now? Another thing that stood out is just the amount of suicides and deaths, in terms of Olympic athletes is staggering, and it's clearly an issue. I think it reflects the problem we're talking about, that they need to solve this. I think Phelps talks about that, like how many people it's going to take before you guys open your eyes. You want these people to represent your country. You want them to dedicate their lives to it, and yet now you're leaving them in a position where they're going to die afterwards. Like it's not okay. If that number of deaths was coming through any other means, I think it would have been taken care of. And now, for some reason, suicide is just still viewed, I think, incorrectly as their fault, their responsibility, right? And it should not be treated that way at all. We talked about I think there was one skater who talked to like the process of building all the way up for this one moment. She was discussing like being on the bus on the way to the performance. And it's like you just worked 4 years and you have like 3 minutes for this thing to happen.
Yeah.
Which is unbelievable to me. I mean, nowhere else does that kind of thing exist in terms of the ratio of prep time to event itself and just how out of sorts those things are. And it makes you realize, I mean, what stood out to me is that the weight of losing gold versus winning gold both have huge challenges. Like you would think like, oh, you won gold, your life's great, but it seemed pretty stressful for a lot of these people. A lot of the ones that win gold don't get any sponsorships or anything like that. I think Apollo Ono kind of talked to that. He's gotten a lot of sponsorships, but even the ones that win gold often don't get any compensation afterwards. And forget about anyone who doesn't win gold. I mean, you're not getting anything.
Yep.
So there's a lot of difficulty for people that win and trying to juggle the media and everything else that kind of comes with that. And then obviously the people that lose, it's like you've worked your way up to this for this many years to get that close and stumble is just, heartbreaking. I think for a lot of people.
And I think a lot of times too, that might be their only shot, right? The Olympics are every 4 years. So if you're not going to fit in in the 4 years, there's someone who's been working just as, working just as hard, who's got the same goal that might be able to take your spot. And I think there's a lot of grief and loss that goes into that.
Totally. Yeah. So he talked about, I had some takeaways from what he's clearly learned in therapy. One was a couple points that I picked out. One, step back and try to understand, why are you so angry? Where are the emotions coming from? We talked about this in the Serena Williams episode, and again, not relative to her because we thought she handled it really well.
Right.
But in terms of when people are exhibiting anger in general, where is the anger coming from? You have to really be introspective, do some work on yourself, understand what are the primary emotions driving that anger. He clearly learned that, right? I would guess it was shame. I don't know, speculating, but he also acknowledges that it's hard, but he does push himself to fight the quote unquote F off mentality. And I think that, to me, that speaks to how therapy is really hard. It's draining even when it's working. And so it's very common, especially for guys, to just at times want to be like, get away from, I don't want to talk about it. Get away from me. Don't make me talk. Like, this is stupid. This sucks. It's annoying. Because it is. It's not stupid, but it is annoying.
It's hard.
It's draining. It's really hard. Even when it's going well. It's like you're talking about things that are there designed to make you feel uncomfortable. That's the work you have to do. It's an investment. You're investing that discomfort up front to save yourself from way more discomfort
in the future.
And again, I know that's hard for people to do that because most people their brain wants to default to what's going to make me feel good now, not later. They're living in the now, which is understandable, and also why substance abuse is a huge issue. So another takeaway from his time in therapy is that he referenced, I don't know if you saw this, he referenced doorway affirmations, which where basically he uses doorways as a cue, and when he walks through a doorway, he says something nice about himself every time, and it leads to almost combating the inner critic daily. So how many times do you walk through a door, right? It's a great cue. I usually use doorways as a cue for body language. So when I work with a lot of young guys, they don't understand how body language impacts their mental health and impacts their emotions and their psychological state. If you're frowning and slumping your shoulders and walking with your head down, that is having an impact on you. It's reflexive, right? They relate to each other. So obviously feeling down or not being in a great place is what leads you to slump and kind of look down and eyes to the ground. But then doing that also makes you actually feel worse. And so an intervention method, a way to intervene and get better, is to actually use doorways as a cue to say, all right, when you walk through a doorway, get your shoulders back, chin up, head high, feeling good about yourself and feeling confident. Even if you don't, sometimes you got to fake it to make it a little bit.
Yep.
But you have to do that because body language, your posture, and even smiling, right, on a regular basis actually releases positive chemicals. So again, that's going to affect your mood. You can artificially generate good moods by doing that on a regular basis. Most people roll their eyes at this, but it does work. It takes work, but it does work. And so that's something that he kind of uses it more as a cue to just be nice to himself, right? To treat himself like his own best coach. Also important. I think I would encourage people to do both. Yeah. Right. Use the doorway as a cue to fix your posture and look at if you got a confident stature. Smile a little bit. Right. Try to release some of those chemicals and say some nice things to yourself. Because guess what? I know people are going to roll their eyes at this. You're talking to yourself all day long, whether you admit it or not.
Or whether you're aware of it or not.
whether
Your
you're aware of it
subconscious
or
is
not,
cranking back
it's
there.
cranking,
Yep.
and it's almost always saying negative things. You're not good enough. That I
Yeah.
was stupid. Like you got to be better. That kind of stuff. It's always happening. So whether you want to admit it or not, or whether you're aware of it or not, it's happening. So why not at least try to sometimes shift that in a positive direction? Because that's the only thing that's going to help you. Let's see. Any other takeaways for you?
No, I think the affirmations piece is big, and I think we'll get into some strategies and pieces like that. And I think I think affirmations is one that can be really important. I do mirror work, so I'll have people actually look at themselves in a mirror and say some of those things to themselves. I think seeing yourself say it to yourself has a different impact. Again,
well, I want to touch on that real quick because I think what's interesting is some people. I actually do a better job of myself saying it internally. I struggle to say it out loud, and especially in the mirror. I do a little bit better when it's written down, but everyone's different. And I think I agree with you on that because I encourage people to try different things because actually, even if the mirror doesn't work for them, I think it's important for them to keep doing it because usually it's a sign that they're self-judgmental and they need to work through that. But you can try to do it internally. I think for most people that doesn't work, right? Because they can't hear it throughout the negative noise, right? So if they're trying to say positive things, it gets drowned out by the critic. You write it down, you see it on paper, that's one. Saying it out loud in general, that's two. And then doing it in front of a mirror, so you're saying it and you're seeing it, that's three. So I agree with you on that.
Yeah, and I think as it pertains to ADHD too, like doing a lot of that internal processing is already a struggle of like organizing thoughts and pieces like that.
Yeah.
So which is what, like actually auditorily, like hearing it out loud has a different impact.
Absolutely. So a few other takeaways for me. I think in the talk he had with DeMar DeRozan that was facilitated by Taylor Rooks, she's a sports journalist. He talks about how saving lives is if he's able to do that through mental health awareness, that's way more important than any gold medal he's ever won or the collection of gold medals, which I thought was cool. And that he said he attacks each day with purpose. And so to me, he's replaced, I think he's successfully replaced swimming with mental health awareness as his new hyperfocus, which is kind of cool. So that's what we're talking about, right? If one is going to disappear and you don't have anything to back it up, you got to find a new one. Yeah. To me, it seems like that's become his new one, which I think is really cool. A couple other kind of fleeting takeaways. He says he needs to start the day with 90 minutes in the gym. One day off, he feels the difference, and I think that that speaks to how important physical health is to your mental health. And we talk about that a lot. And again, I think it gets eye rolls, but like you got to be active. You have to stay active. It helps combat mental health issues. He also says the pandemic has been the hardest time for him. Yeah. This is someone who was having suicidal thoughts in 2014, and the pandemic has been the hardest time for him. And I think it's because it's harder to be active and it's hard to see people when you're used to seeing people. That's really a struggle. So I think a lot of people are dealing with that right now, and that stood out to me. So we're going to get into the issue of ADHD a little bit here. I want to give some data with regard to ADHD, and we've created an ADHD program, ADHD and 8, that we use in working with a lot of young guys. And some of the data that came up is really interesting. 40% are more likely to get divorced. When you have ADHD, you're 40% more likely to get divorced, 30% more likely to be unemployed, 40% of the addicted population have ADHD. Again, we talked about secondary issues and how often that leads to substance abuse. The prevalence is higher. So 5.9 to 7.1% of children and adolescents have ADHD, which is pretty high. I would guess it's actually higher than that. And then it affects males at 3 times more often than it does females. So medication, is initially usually a positive part of the treatment. We don't give medical advice, but we usually encourage clients to, get an effective diagnosis first, an accurate diagnosis, and then talk to either like a psychiatrist or a primary care doctor or pediatrician about medication options, because research has shown that medication does tend to be a very helpful, important piece of ADHD. Doesn't work for everyone. We talked about how Michael Phelps stopped taking, he was on a stimulant. Usually there's more than 2 types, but the most common types of medication that people take for ADHD, one is stimulant medications, so think Adderall, Ritalin, things like that. And the other one is usually like some form of SSRI, which stands for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. And that is a type of antidepressant that people take. Some of them also tend to help with symptoms of ADHD. Some of them even help when it comes to quitting smoking. I can't remember the one. Wellbutrin maybe is the one that tends to be used for quitting smoking as well. So it depends on the person. I think obviously people who have any past substance abuse issues, they tend to get steered away from stimulants. But medication tends to be a helpful part of treatment. though not the only part. So we're going to get into sort of the rundown, the diagnosis rundown of ADHD. It's a neurobiological disorder. So again, it's a little bit different. You know, we talked a lot about anxiety and depression. Those are mood disorders. This is a neurobiological disorder, which means it's the way your brain works. I don't like the disorder word.
Yeah.
I would say it's a difference in neurobiological functioning, I think is a better way to put it.
Yeah.
So someone with ADHD, their brain works differently. That's lifelong. That's not going to change, right? So it's more about like learning how to adapt to it and make it work for you than it is about trying to get it to go away. Whereas things like anxiety and depression, we're trying to remove those symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
We already talked about deficit disorder. Can't stand how those are in the term,
Yeah.
but we just have to roll with it. It is what it is. It used to be a difference between ADD and ADHD. You know, one was attention deficit, so the lack of focus, and one was the hyperactive side. Now it's just all called ADHD, and there's 3 subtypes. So everything's called ADHD, and the 3 subtypes are, primarily inattentive but no hyperactivity. Second one is hyperactivity but no inattentive issues, and then the third one is combined type, which is both of them, which we typically see the most. I mean, it's usually combined. There's a difference in diagnosis approach to child versus adolescent versus adult. So it's a little bit different. If you're an adult, you're probably going to go through a different process. When you're under 18, you're usually looking to get verification of these issues with attention span and hyperactivity from multiple areas of their life. You really it can't just be happening at home.
Right.
If it's just happening at home, that might speak to a different issue like anxiety or something else, maybe trauma. If it's happening in school and at home, now you have 2 areas. That's usually verification. Or if it's not school, sometimes it's home and social life, where you see it happening with friendships. So typically, we're not going to go through the whole diagnosis, but there are 9 symptoms of being inattentive or losing focus that they look for. And then there's 9 symptoms of being hyperactive. And you have to meet 6 of the 9 inattentive symptoms and 6 of the 9 hyperactive symptoms. And then again, 2 areas of life have to be significantly impacted by the ADHD. What to do about ADHD? As always, quick disclaimer: try to connect with a mental health professional to get a diagnosis. And a lot of tools and strategies with mental health are easy to understand but hard to execute. So we're going to get into it a little bit. First step: get an accurate diagnosis. A lot of times ADHD can be masked. It looks like ADHD, but it's something else. Again, it could be anxiety. It can be it could be actually be depression. Sometimes there's both, right? We talked about how the link between those secondary issues. Sometimes they have ADHD and anxiety and or depression, right?
Yep.
It could be all those, but sometimes it's just anxiety driving what looks like difficulty focusing.
Yep. Trauma's another big one.
Trauma's another definitely a big one. Substance abuse, and then sleep deprivation is a big one. The kids, especially kids these days, are staying up till whatever hours in the morning playing video games at times. And we don't think video games are a bad thing. We just think they are when they're costing you sleep.
Mm-hmm.
And if you haven't slept more than a couple hours a night for a long period of time, you're going to look like you can't focus, but it's not because you have ADHD. It's because you're sleep deprived, and that leads to symptoms of not being able to focus. I talked about medication being a big thing. Tempering expectations is huge. Again, ADHD is lifelong. It's not going to go away. And it can be a positive. So I would caution people to kind of beware of what you've been told, and especially watch out for projecting your whole life out based on how things have gone in 1 or 2 particular areas. A lot of times ADHD and what it does to the self-image of a person, it just ruins their self-image and ruins learning for them a lot of times, right? If they're able to make it through high school, they never want to learn anything again. And it's such a shame, because if they could just find something they like and that they're passionate about, they would be able to hyper-focus on that subject and really excel at it if they're able to stick to it. So that I would caution people, if you have ADHD and it's led to a difficulty in functioning at times, that doesn't have to define the rest of your life. A lot of times it's because you didn't know what was going on and you blamed yourself instead of understanding that your brain just works a little bit differently. So do you have anything that you want to get into specifically for how to deal with ADHD?
Yeah, I think the first, especially with kids, the first thing I always get into is just like some psychoeducation or just education around ADHD just in general. And, I think a lot of the things that we see, especially with the younger kids, this sort of like hyperactivity. And I think a lot of times, the approach for that is sort of this more like authoritative, like, hard line piece with kids. And I think helping both kids and parents understand that, kids with ADHD are probably looking for like some stimulation, and arguing and being angry and tantruming is a really, really effective way of getting stimulation.
They don't even know they're doing it, but like, look, when the brain needs stimulation, it's just going to go get it where it wants it.
Yep.
And arguments with family is like number one.
Oh,
right?
it's the easiest one. I think it doesn't help necessarily address the issue, but I think it does add perspective, especially for parents of like, this is what's really going on, right? I think trying to
Instead of
help
blaming
them
them.
understand, right?
Yes.
Exactly. I think helping them understand like what is the messaging, right, versus what is the vehicle for that message, right? I think we see that a lot of like the tantruming behavior, but what they're really trying is like, I need stimulation, right? I need to find a different way of doing this. And I think so that's definitely a big component of that. We talked about this earlier too, but just the perspective of ADHD in general, and really trying to make it like a reframe or rethink about it in a way from a positive perspective, rather than this thing that's going to be like a deterrent for the rest of your life. You just spoke about that. I think that's definitely something that gets pretty ingrained in kids with ADHD. So helping parents understand like, here's how we're going to talk about it, and then teaching them and the person you're working with, how do you even talk about it, and using the language that you're going to use, I think is really important. And focusing on all the attributes that they possess, probably with ADHD, but never really identified with or took time to cultivate. Like a lot of times with people with ADHD, entrepreneurial skills are huge. They can take 15 different thoughts that they have in their head at once and sort of simultaneously process it into one single vision.
Yeah.
That's something that someone with ADHD has no capability of doing.
Yeah.
And so that's like talking about those pieces. Oftentimes people with ADHD far more resilient, so they can move on from things quicker, right? They don't have the time to pay attention to it, so they're already off doing something else. So helping them understand that there's some real strengths to it is definitely the first step that I usually take when I'm working with someone with ADHD, whether it's an adult with ADHD or whether it's a kid. Within it's a kid, it's usually obviously including the parents into that conversation so that they're aware. But also like just education on that, and really trying to shift the narrative that they've probably been telling themselves and try to supplement it with one and substitute it basically with another one that's actually more positive and goal directed.
Yeah, those are great points, because I think you're going right into saying like they are probably coming in with some level of awareness of all their weaknesses, or what they've been told their weaknesses are,
right?
And you're quickly getting into pointing out like, actually, this can be a superpower for you in a lot of different ways. It can be a huge strength if you know how to harness it, and if you stop looking at only the negatives as they relate to how things play out in certain areas, often at no fault of their own.
Right.
Look at the things that you are actually able to accomplish, and totally flips it. Right. It changes their perspective on like, wow, this is actually a good thing. This is a sign. It's not a deficit. It's not a disorder. It's something that I could actually harness and use in my life and feel good about. Wow. Right. So that's definitely a good first step. And you talk about family education and support. Having some understanding, patience, and support from friends and family is crucial when it comes to ADHD. The people in their life have to know that this is what's happening, because otherwise they are going to blame the person instead of understanding what's driving this. If you don't understand what's driving and what ADHD is, you're just going to make it the person's fault and think that they're doing it intentionally. And this happens with parents and kids a lot. They think the argumentativeness is like they're just trying to be difficult, right. Or they're trying, they're a bad kid, or they're trying to annoy me. No, they need stimulation, right? So put it in that context, it allows you to not take it as personally as a parent.
Yep.
And you can go find different ways adaptively, right, or proactively, which we've talked about, to get them stimulated so that they don't have to come out and argue with you in different ways, right? So, and it's really key, even when you're an adult, I think it's key for your siblings or your family or your spouses or significant others, especially if you're in a relationship. They need to know what ADHD is, because if they don't, it's often going to cause a rift, and it doesn't have to.
Yeah, I think patience is key. I think when it comes to communication with ADHD, often are more prone to like interrupt, right? So if you're in a conversation with somebody and they say something that triggers a thought, you with ADHD, you don't want to forget it because you know you're probably going to.
Yep.
So you want to just make that point right away. And I think that starts to hinder that communication, that relationship with that person of like, oh gosh, here comes John interrupting me. And I am absolutely guilty of that, of interrupting sometimes. But I think if people understand that this is not like, there's no intentionality behind like I'm trying to be disrespectful, it's just a component of what it is. Obviously there's work to be done on addressing that, and that's the individual work. But that just understanding what that person's going through makes a huge difference. You talked about like not taking it personal. That's big. And I see that a lot of times with like parents who might be coming in who are feeling frustrated and like, I don't understand why it's not working. I don't understand what's going on. And there's this level of frustration, and also this level of like, what am I not doing as a parent, right? This like, I'm disappointing myself. I can't do this. And I think when you give them like, hey, here's what's going on, and here's some ways of trying to address this in a different way, they, like you said, like taking things personal starts to get removed, and they can just more go address what needs to be addressed and find substitutes for stimulation rather than just the arguments.
Absolutely. Great point. So we're wrapping up for today. I'm gonna kind of do a quick rundown, and again, I'm gonna go through these fast, but we'll put them in our notes on the website too, in case people want to go back and review them. Organization and planning is really key. Structure is key. A person with ADHD tends to lack that internal structure, which again can be a strength because it allows them to not be, sort of beholden to one idea. They are like off in their imagination, thinking about lots of different ideas, which is a great. It allows them to be creative, but there's no structure there. So they need structure in their life that allows to kind of harness some of their lack of structure internally at times. So how do you get structure? Well, you look to modify your three environments: physical, digital, mental, right? Where are you doing work in your physical environment? Look to remove as many of the distractions as you can and implement as many habits as you can, right? So in physical environment, you're going to remove as many distractions as you can. Think about the senses. What are the visual, auditory distractions that are always getting in your way and taking your mindset from being focused on one thing to now off in your imagination? Try to get rid of those things. Same with digitally, right? The phone is a huge distraction. Put stuff on do not disturb. Set app limits. Get rid of notifications. Totally, right? The things that are just, that are designed to get you to go back into these apps, you have to neutralize those because that's even hard for someone without ADHD. Forget about it if you have ADHD. It's like you're always going to be going into something on your phone. And then, the mental environment in terms of modifying that gets more into like cognitive behavioral therapy and understanding your negative thought patterns around yourself, around your future, around life, and how those are leading to distraction. So again, we're removing distractions from the three environments. We're implementing habits as much as we can. Habit forming is difficult. You got to learn about that. We'll probably do a different episode where we get into that a little bit more. Yeah. Because it takes time. It's like 66 plus days on average to form a new habit. And then getting into a flow state, I think, is something that we work on with athletes and clients dealing with ADHD. So I put 8 steps for getting into a flow state. Eliminate all internal distractions from environments. Eliminate all external distractions. Do work at your ideal time. Listen to the right type of music. Everyone's different. You'd be surprised. Like I've met with clients that have like heavy metal just locks them in, whereas I'm someone that needs to listen to more like movie scores or soundtracks that without words that kind of gets me in the zone. Next one is plan ahead so that the step is specific. Again, you have to learn how to break large goals down into small steps, or else you're really not going to be able to take the first step. You'll procrastinate. Make sure you're in the zone of proximal development. What that means is, and we talk a lot about this in our work, the zone of proximal development is also called the 20% rule. And that means you always want to be 20% out of your comfort zone. If you're 0%, it means you're not challenging yourself enough. If you're 100%, it means you're biting off more than you can chew, and that's just going to shut you down. So you got to find a way when you're taking on projects and you're doing different things, make sure you're doing it in a realistic approach where you're growing at the right amount. You're 20% out of your comfort zone. It allows you to grow as a person, but not shut you down, right, or keep you stagnant. Let's see. So again, understanding habits is important. And then I consider consumption, right? So caffeine can kind of help. It's a stimulant a little bit for people with ADHD. But obviously drinking water is really important, and getting away from sugar. Sugar is really a bad idea. It's going to make the symptoms worse. Other points we'll get to real quick, being your own best coach. We've talked a lot about self one versus self two. You have to be able to coach yourself like the best coach or best boss you've ever had, not like the opposite. Then we want to understand that procrastination is very tempting. Okay, the brain needs comfort, and it's very tempting when you're facing something difficult like a project or a task. The brain associates that quickly with feeling bad, and it's going to run around and try to find something that wants to make it feel good. And you have to be aware of that and account for it and fight through it instead of letting it take over. Lastly, learn to plan. Again, breaking large goals down to small steps. If I could encourage anyone listening, if they struggle with ADHD or even distraction, there's 2 key things that I want you to remember. Always put the hardest thing first. Most people do the opposite. They do the easiest thing and they work up. That's going to lead to kicking the can down the road. Start every day with the hardest thing. You get it out of the way, and it's smooth sailing downhill from there. And then use the 2-minute rule. I do this all the time in my house. I still have to fight the urge to just ignore and procrastinate. If I have to get the laundry, if I got to do a few dishes, if it's going to take less than 2 minutes, just do it. Do it and get it out of the way. Use the 2-minute rule, because that stuff builds up and it ends up causing stress. Other than that, obviously behavioral activation is key. You got to burn off some of the energy, right? So exercise is really important. Nutrition and low sugar is really important. And then sleep, right? We talked about how if you're sleep deprived, it's going to mimic ADHD even if you don't have it. If you have ADHD and you're sleep deprived, forget about it. Your symptoms are going to be off the charts in terms of distraction. So that's all. You got anything else to add, John, for ADHD?
No, I think those are the key ones. I think that we talked about it, but structure is key, and adding structure to it so that they can follow through and make things more manageable is big.
Absolutely. So quick reminder to everyone listening that just click and subscribe on your podcast listening platform and rate and review the podcast if possible. We really appreciate all feedback. We're trying to get better as we do this. We're going to offer a pair of free Celtics tickets to a game next season, not this season, so the 2021 to 2022 season, for one lucky person out of all who write an honest review for us in the first 3 months of 2021. You can enter to win these tickets by taking a screenshot of your review and submitting that through the Contact Us option on our website at grimdrive.com. It will ask you for your name and email address, and will provide you with the option to upload the screenshot file. Just make sure you take the screenshot of the review before you submit it. Otherwise, you'll lose the ability to get proof of that. One other reminder, all the helpful information and links that we described in this episode can be accessed in the show notes and on our website at grimdrive.com. Thank you for listening to the Grim Drive podcast for this discussion about Michael Phelps and ADHD. We'll be back next week to talk about most likely a Boston athlete. We're not sure yet, so I'm just going to tease it. We'll leave it at that. We'll see you next week.
Thanks, everyone.